Hi, I'm Dr. Michael Morgenstern, and today I'm going to talk to you about diabetes. If you're somebody who wants to know more about diabetes, you have high blood sugar, you have pre-diabetes, or maybe you have a parent or a relative who has diabetes, this might be the type of information that is useful to you. Also, if you're health conscious, you're overweight, which might put you at risk for diabetes, this type of video will explain diabetes in more detail. I'm going to start from the very basics, and I'm really going to learn with you by looking online at readily available sources, and I'll also comment on those sources and perhaps fill in some of the gaps of the information that's available online. I'll also look at more detail about diabetes that might not be readily available online, but is certainly available in the type of sources that doctors look at, like medical textbooks or research articles online, and I'll show you how I go about even finding some of those sources, so you don't have to rely on a video like this to find some of the sources on your own, but I'll certainly give you some of the background that you might need to know in order to understand this information fast. If you're a nurse or you're a healthcare practitioner, this video might also be helpful to give you an overview of what diabetes is like. Another one of my goals is to be able to explain this easily in a way that you can understand it, which is kind of a way that I know that I understand it, because if I can't explain it simply, I probably don't know it well enough, and I like to learn. So let's learn together about diabetes. We'll start out by typing in diabetes into a search engine, and we'll take it from there. So the first thing to do is just go to Google and type in diabetes, or you can type in diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And we're going to look at some of the sources. And so the first thing that pops up here is a nice little image on the right side that says type 2 diabetes, and we're going to let Google explain it to me. It also says it's called adult onset diabetes, which is in many ways a misnomer because type 2 diabetes occurs more and more in younger kids and adolescents and teenagers. And over here you can see there's a figure of an individual who's testing his blood sugar levels before he eats a hamburger, a cheeseburger, and a nice healthy meal. And also there's some sort of image that shows insulin resistance versus normal no resistance. And you can see glucose and insulin in that picture. I think it's a really terrible picture actually because it's talking or it's supposed to be showing insulin moving into cells, glucose into cells, but there's no obvious image of a cell here, and it's unclear what this is, although I know what it is based on just my knowledge. So let's see how Google defines type 2 diabetes. It says it's a chronic condition that affects the way the body processes blood sugar. That's true. That's true, it is. And it is definitely a chronic condition, but it is marked by having high blood sugar, which is not something that it says over here, so it's not really a complete definition. Although below, let's see what it says. With type 2 diabetes, the body either doesn't produce enough insulin or it resists insulin. And then it goes on to tell you symptoms. Symptoms: increased thirst, frequent urination, hunger, fatigue, and blurred vision. In some cases, there may be no symptoms. And treatment includes diet, exercise, medication, and insulin therapy. Well, so here's what I would say. It's slightly misleading, I'm going to be honest. It says over here that the symptoms include increased thirst, frequent urination. So I think, and a few other symptoms. And it says, and blurred vision. So the average person, if you were to read this literally as it's written, you would infer that you have to have symptoms, or you would normally have symptoms when you have diabetes. And in reality, it says in some cases there may be no symptoms. It's usually that there are no symptoms until the disease is more advanced. So if somebody has all of these symptoms in their first presentation, either they're in the hospital or they're in really bad shape and have had diabetes for a very long time, because it's really a progression of illness. So let's take a look at WebMD and see how WebMD defines it for us. And we'll just open this. I actually have it open already. It says that it's a lifelong disease. In other words, it's chronic, although lifelong could mean that you've had it since birth and didn't develop it later. That affects the way your body handles glucose, a kind of sugar in your blood. And so there are other types of sugar. There's fructose, which you could eat. Apples are high in fructose, and that's different than glucose, which is a simple sugar. Fructose is a more complex type of sugar. Most people with the condition have type 2. So type 2 is the most common type, and as you can see right here, it can affect about 27 million people, or affects about 27 million people. And it says over here that 86 million more people have what's called prediabetes. And that's really where they don't meet the criteria for diabetes because their blood glucose doesn't really meet that cutoff. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. But it is high, it's elevated beyond what normal would be, but just not high enough yet to be diabetes. Then it asks, what causes diabetes? And this is where it is going to introduce to us insulin. So insulin is something that allows your cells to take glucose from food and turn that food and that glucose into energy. And what it does is it allows cells to take glucose and for those cells to use the glucose which they need for energy. So you can think of your cells as being like a little emoji or a smiley face, and it's trying to eat sugar, which is its primary source of food and energy. And the insulin is kind of like the spoon that carries that sugar and allows that to eat it because it couldn't pick up the sugar without the spoon. Here it goes on to say that people with type 2 diabetes make insulin, but their cells don't use it as well as they should. And that doctors call this insulin resistance. At first, so this is saying at first it's one thing, but then in the future it'll be something else. So it's hinting towards a progression of illness. At first, the pancreas makes more insulin to try to get glucose into the cells, but eventually it can't keep up. And the sugar builds up in your blood instead. So you have sugar building up in your blood, you have high levels of sugar in your blood. But let's define this exactly. What does that mean in your blood? I thought my cells were in my blood. So the cells include blood cells like red blood cells and white blood cells, and they kind of float around in this red liquid. And the part that isn't cells is called plasma. And that in that plasma, we measure with blood tests, we can measure the sugar levels, and that should be at a regular baseline level, let's say of 100 or 80. And that baseline level, your body tries to use insulin in order to regulate and keep it nice and smooth and relaxed so that whenever your cells need to have energy, they can draw on that sugar. Sometimes, like not after eating, when you're fasting, your body needs to produce sugar or have sugar available to certain cells in the body when you're fasting. So your body also needs a way to produce sugar when it doesn't have food available. So what your body often does is it stores energy in the liver, and then by releasing something called glucagon, your body will allow things in the liver that are stored to be converted into sugar in the bloodstream, which then other cells can use. So some of the major organs in your body, which are made up of a lot of cells that also are often consuming sugar, include your muscles, which are very active, as well as your liver, and even the pancreas itself. The pancreas, which has beta cells in them that actually produce insulin, they are also taking in. So every cell in your body really needs glucose, and they're all working together. Over here, it then is going to go on and say a combination of things cause type 2 diabetes. Genes, extra weight. That's a really big one, is extra weight. So being overweight or obese, which is a BMI over 30, and a BMI over 25, which is a body mass index over 25, is overweight. And I'll actually give you a little link to a calculator that you can use in my comments to determine what your body mass index is. It's based on your height and weight. So if you have that, if you're overweight, that really can contribute, and it really does contribute towards getting diabetes, as do genes. So having a family history makes a big deal. Having a relative, a first-degree relative, a mother, a father, brother, sister, or child who has diabetes, that's a big risk factor as well. Then over here it says metabolic syndrome. that doesn't really make sense because metabolic syndrome is not really going to cause diabetes. Metabolic syndrome is more a function of having diabetes. Metabolic syndrome means you have diabetes, high blood pressure, and high cholesterol. It's the triad. Those three things define metabolic syndrome. So it doesn't really make sense to say that metabolic syndrome causes diabetes. Too much glucose from your liver. So that's another problem, is not just being able to handle sugar that you've consumed. It's not just that you can't bring those sugar levels down low enough on a regular basis, but it's also that your body is actually malfunctioning in that the liver is producing too much glucose. So it's normal, like I said, when you're in a fasting state for your liver to produce sugar so that your cells have enough energy. So if your cells have enough energy, they're nice and happy. But when you're eating, for example, you don't want your liver to be producing sugar. You want your liver to just be like holding everything in. And so one of the reasons that might happen is bad communication between cells. So your cells actually signal between each other, and there's a bunch of different players. So there's bad communication between them. And also you could have beta cells that are misfunctioning or broken. What is this?
Broken beta cells.
Oh, that's cool. So you can just right click and it'll read it to you on this site. So if the cells that make insulin, are beta cells. So if they don't function properly, they may not secrete insulin properly, then you're not going to have enough insulin to handle the sugar that comes in. And then you might have high blood sugar and you might end up with diabetes. All right, so that's WebMD. And if we go to symptoms here, it's going to list some of these symptoms again. The symptoms of type 2 diabetes may include increased thirst, increased hunger, dry mouth, frequent urination, unexplained weight loss, fatigue, blurred vision, headaches, loss of consciousness. But what's not showing up here is that in reality, you won't have any symptoms in the beginning of diabetes. It's a progression. So this is where some of these articles really can be misleading and have unintended consequences, where people will say, look, I don't have these symptoms, so I'm just not going to go to the doctor. And in reality, they could have full-fledged diabetes. So let's look at Mayo Clinic. All right, so Mayo Clinic says that type 2, and here you can see what I was mentioning, once known as adult onset or non-insulin dependent. Once known, so no longer known as adult onset, but yet Google mentions it as being adult onset now. Is a chronic condition that affects the way your body metabolizes sugar, your body's important source of fuel, that your body either resists the effects of insulin or it doesn't produce enough insulin to maintain normal glucose, and that diet and exercise can help. And then it talks about the symptoms. But over here it says, in fact, you can have type 2 diabetes for years and not know it. So I think that's actually important to mention, and some of these other websites don't mention it, and you could easily miss that. And then it talks about symptoms, the role of glucose, and other things. So this is a pretty good site. I like it, and I think it provides a good baseline of information. And then you could also take a look at Wikipedia, which always has a lot of information, but it's hard to also sort through the good and bad. But here it talks about it as being a long-term metabolic disorder characterized by high blood sugar, insulin resistance, and a relative lack of insulin. So that's something I think that wasn't discussed in other definitions. That is accurate. It also, again, just talks about common symptoms. Doesn't really say that people don't have symptoms here. NIH has the National Institute of Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Disease has a website as well. And let's see what they say. They have type 2 diabetes, common type of diabetes that occurs when your blood glucose is too high. So that's really more accurate. It's that your sugar is too high. The cause of it is that your body is not functioning properly. There's chronic disease. Over here, it defines that blood glucose is your main source of energy and comes mainly from food you eat, and that insulin helps glucose get into cells to be used for energy. That's important, right? But some of that is also, it's storing it for future energy. So that's one of the places where a lot of your sugar will go to when things are working correctly. And in type 2 diabetes, your body doesn't make enough insulin or it doesn't use insulin well. Too much glucose then stays in your blood and not enough reaches your cells. Here it has a few things that it says causes type 2 diabetes, such as overweight and obesity, not being physically active, insulin resistant, and genes. And there's some other good information here. And I think these are all good for really getting started in knowing some of the general information. Some people don't want to know all of the very detailed information. But what is this pre-diabetes everybody's talking about? Okay, so over here it says that pre-diabetes is where your A1C, which is one of the ways that you can test for long-term blood sugar control, or your blood glucose is higher than normal, but it's not enough for a diagnosis of diabetes. And so they call that pre-diabetes. Another source that I like is UpToDate. And over here, if you just Google UpToDate and you Google any type of diagnosis, something may come up. And it defines it as disrupting the way your body uses glucose. That's what diabetes is. And that all your cells need sugar to work normally, and that insulin helps the sugar get into the cells. And if there's not enough insulin, or if the body stops responding to insulin, sugar builds up in the blood, and that's what happens here. So why should you even care if you do have high blood sugar? What's the big deal, right? Well, it turns out that having diabetes actually and high blood sugar causes a lot of problems in the long term. It can cause damage to your heart and blood vessels. So it can cause heart attacks, and it can cause strokes. It can cause nerve damage or neuropathy, which can be severe pain for many people. It can cause kidney damage, and it can cause people to need to have dialysis, cause blindness in certain cases, or eye disease, foot problems, hearing problems, skin conditions, and Alzheimer's disease. And if you think that's all, it's not. It can cause problems with virtually anywhere in your body, and so it's really a bad thing. And it really contributes towards other problems as well, like high blood pressure and even obesity. So there's this bidirectional relationship that exists between all of these different diseases states, that having one makes the others worse. All right, so that was basically some of the information that's readily available online that you could see. And now I'm going to go into detail a little bit more about diabetes and give you my perspective of what it is in a more integrated fashion.